Wearing combat boots to your wedding pathetic. That was the message. No greeting, no congratulations. Just 7 words from a number I hadn't saved in years but would never forget. My father, Colonel Patrick Wren, retired Marine Force Recon, decorated and feared, and for as long as I could remember, deeply disappointed in his only child. I was standing behind the chapel doors at the Norfolk-based chapel, hands steady on my white dress uniform. 4 stars gleamed on my shoulder. Ribbons stitched in sacrifice lined my chest. The steel toe of my ceremonial boots tapped softly against the marble floor. Behind me, 2 of my oldest team members stood like sentinels. Chief Marcus Hill and Senior Chief Torres, men I had led into combat, pulled from wreckage and saluted in silence. They were supposed to be guests. They had insisted on being escorts. In front of me, a room filled with my team, nearly 200 Navy SEALs. Men who never flinched under fire. Men who didn't cry at funerals. Men who showed up without an invitation saying only, "You don't walk alone." I looked down at my phone one last time. The text still burned on the screen. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. This was who he had always been, and this was who I had become. The chapel doors opened. A flood of light bathed the entrance. My boots struck forward, crisp, steady, echoing with certainty. And then from within the pews, a single voice rang out. "Admiral on deck?" The sound of 200 SEALs standing to attention followed. No hesitation, no protocol required, just respect. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. My throat tightened not from pain, but from something far rarer, belonging. My father wasn't here, but my family was. And as I walked forward beneath the eyes of the men and women I bled for, trained, commanded, and buried, I realized something profound. Blood didn't salute, but honor did. And that was enough to begin this story. I was born into the military not by enlistment, but by legacy. My earliest memories were not lullabies or cartoons, but cadence calls echoing from VHS tapes, and the scent of boot polish filling the kitchen. Colonel Patrick Wren was not just my father, he was an institution. A 3-tour Force Recon legend, whose photo hung in the Marine Hall of Valor, and whose voice could freeze a room with a single glance. He raised me like a recruit, not a daughter. Meals were scheduled at 1800 sharp shoes were lined at 45-degree angles, and any form of emotion was labeled as weakness. I tried to earn his attention in every way I could. Straight A's, perfect attendance, first place in track meets. But those were civilian metrics, and he only respected valor under fire. He never hit me, never shouted, but somehow his silence hurt more. My mother, Rachel, was the only softness in that house. A high school art teacher who wore soft cardigans and whispered poetry into my ear when I couldn't sleep. She called me her bright steel strong sharp, but still capable of light. When I was 10, my father took me to my first change of command ceremony. Rows of Marines in dress blues flags rippling the echo of Semper Fi carried in the wind. I told him I wanted to be like them. He looked down, then away. Marines are made of grit, not glass. I knew what he meant. I wasn't born his son. From that moment, something inside me changed. I stopped asking for approval and started building quiet resolve. I studied military history obsessively, memorized ranks, formations, tactics. I could recite the chain of command by 13. And at 15, while ironing his dress blues before a ceremony, I caught my reflection in the brass buttons and whispered, "One day I'll wear stars too." When I turned 17, I told him I planned to apply to the Naval Academy. I didn't say it to defy him. I said it because it was the truest thing I'd ever known. He didn't yell. He didn't speak. The next morning, a manila envelope sat on my desk. Inside were applications to nursing schools, community colleges, and a single Christian seminary. I stared at the paperwork, then at him. "There's not a single anchor on any of these." He said nothing, just walked away. I submitted my Naval Academy application without his blessing. When the acceptance letter came, I held it in shaking hands and ran into the living room to share the news. My mother wept. My father didn't look up from his newspaper. "You'll regret choosing weakness over honor." That was the last thing he said to me before I left for Annapolis. He didn't show up to the send-off, didn't write a letter, didn't answer my calls. I thought maybe he just needed time. But time turned to years, and the silence only grew louder. Annapolis wasn't easy. It wasn't meant to be. I was one of only a handful of women in my cohort aiming for combat specialization. Whispers followed me everywhere. Poster girl, quota filler, quota, cute until someone dies. But I didn't flinch. I worked harder, ran longer, learned faster. I graduated near the top of my class, earned my first bar, and shipped out to Okinawa. I sent my parents a photo in uniform. Mom replied with a care package and a poem. My father sent nothing. That pattern repeated at every milestone. When I was awarded my first leadership citation, silence. When I led a successful hostage extraction in Jakarta, nothing. When I was wounded in Bahrain and still completed the mission, no response. Every call unreturned. Every email ignored. But still, I hoped. Hoped that someday he would see that strength didn't wear just one uniform. That valor wasn't reserved for the sons of the Corps. The ache was subtle but constant, like phantom pain from a limb never granted. And yet I kept rising not for him, but in spite of him. I thought one day perhaps the medals would speak louder than my voice ever could. But by the time I pinned on Rear Admiral, I had stopped dialing. My mother passed away during my third deployment. Cancer. Quick and cruel. My father didn't tell me until the hospice nurse called. I arrived 2 days before the end. She was all bones and bravery. She took my hand and whispered, "Don't stop flying." That night, I stood in the hallway outside her room, staring at my father's back as he stared at her still form. I wanted to scream to blame, to shatter the perfect silence he built around himself. But I didn't, because deep down I knew he'd never hear it. He only listened to the language of command, so I saluted her casket as it was lowered, then flew back to base. No letter followed, just silence. And that silence, more than any war zone I'd walked through, taught me that some wounds are inherited, not earned. But they can be survived. My first assignment after Annapolis was far from glamorous. Logistics command in Okinawa, paperwork inventory keeping egos in check. My father would have called it desk jockey work. I called it Phase 1. Most of my colleagues expected me to tap out within a year. Female untested, wearing ambition like cologne. But I lasted 5. I memorized every policy manual. I ran PT like I was chasing ghosts. I didn't speak unless necessary, didn't laugh unless I'd earned it. I learned every face in my unit, knew who had a newborn back home, who drank too much when no one watched, who never flinched under pressure. I built quiet influence brick by brick. While others competed for attention, I mastered the system. I rewrote outdated workflows, reduced shipment errors by 40%. When a senior officer took credit for my efficiency overhaul, I let him. But when his numbers dropped the moment I transferred command took notice. They promoted me to a joint task force in the Mediterranean embedded with special warfare units. It was there during a routine night op off the Somali coast that everything changed. We were supporting a recon team tracking arms movement through a hostile coastal corridor. What was supposed to be quiet surveillance turned into chaos. Communications blackout. One unit ambushed 2 injured, one trapped behind a rusted shipping container. I was a lieutenant commander then. Technically not required to deploy, but I strapped on my vest and went anyway. I remember the air that night dry and metallic, like it knew what was coming. Gunfire broke the silence in staccato bursts. I found the trapped sailor, Private Larkin. His leg was shredded below the knee. He was fading fast. I dragged him 40 yards under open fire, tourniquet in one hand, radio in the other, called in a medevac while keeping pressure on his artery. Shrapnel tore through my ribs. I didn't stop. I didn't feel it until much later. By the time we got him aboard the evac chopper, my uniform was soaked in blood that wasn't all his. I refused a stretcher. Walked back to the landing zone on my own feet. The men started calling me Iceback after that. Said I bled ice. I hated the name. Not because it wasn't true, but because they thought it meant I felt nothing. I felt everything, especially the responsibility. Private Larkin lived. He still sends me a Christmas card every year. His daughter's name is Alina Wren. Not a coincidence. After that op, the tone shifted. Briefly. I was no longer the girl in the unit. I was the one they followed without asking why. But even then, the recognition came with caveats. I remember a commanding officer once introducing me to a visiting general by saying, "She's tough for a woman." I smiled, and then made sure the next quarter our unit outperformed every other division in the region. Promotions came faster after that. I earned them, but they still came with shadows. Whispers about quotas, rumors that I had connections. I let my work silence them. By 2015, I was appointed to lead SEAL qualification training reforms at Coronado. That's where I truly found purpose. I watched too many good candidates get cut for politics, not performance. Too many pushed past breaking for the sake of ego, not growth. So I rewrote modules, added resilience checkpoints, mandatory psychological support, quietly. No press, just impact. In 12 months, dropout rates dropped 11%. Injury rates halved. The brass didn't give me a medal, but the instructor started calling me ma'am without the sarcasm. I didn't need applause, just proof. In 2018, I received my third star. I mailed a photo home. No response. I told myself I no longer cared, but that was a lie I wore like armor. The truth, every ceremony, every salute, I still looked for a figure in the back of the room, someone who'd never show. When the fourth star came, I didn't celebrate. I sat alone in my quarters. I thought of my mother, of how proud she would have been. I pulled out the one thing I kept from her, a note written on the back of an old shopping list. Let the world doubt. You know who you are. I tucked it back in my breast pocket, then stood in front of the mirror. White dress uniform, 4 stars, and a face that no longer needed anyone else's permission to lead. From that day, I stopped chasing recognition. I became it, not in title, but in the quiet ways that mattered. I created mentorship pipelines for underrepresented recruits, reformed outdated tactical protocols, pushed for trauma-informed debriefing standards, most of it behind closed doors, most of it unnoticed. But the men noticed, the ones I led, the ones who walked through hell with me and didn't ask why I wore a skirt under my gear. They called me Admiral, not because the brass said so, but because I'd earned it in sand blood and silence. My father still hadn't spoken to me in over 15 years, and I thought that silence was final. Until the wedding. Until the message. Until everything changed again. His name was Nathan, and he didn't flinch the first time I told him I wasn't the marrying type. We met during a joint medical simulation on base. He was a military trauma surgeon assigned temporarily to review casualty extraction protocols. I'd just returned from a deployment in Northern Africa. My patience was thin, my uniform still dusty, and my tolerance for bureaucratic exercises non-existent. He called my field report deliberate but cold. I replied, "Lives don't need warmth, they need accuracy." He didn't smile. He rewrote the entire report that night using my format. Said, "You were right, but I wanted to understand why." That was the beginning. Nathan wasn't loud. He didn't wear rank like armor. He didn't try to outmatch me in command or pretend to understand every shadow I carried. He simply showed up, quietly, consistently. The first time he saw me in full dress uniform, he said, "I've never seen truth worn like a second skin before." I laughed and told him I'd worn it so long I didn't know how to take it off. He said, "Then don't." He never asked me to be softer. Never asked why I disappeared during certain anniversaries. Never questioned why I kept a locked drawer filled with letters I never sent. He once found me standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., cleaning my boots in complete silence. He didn't interrupt, just handed me a cup of tea and sat on the floor beside me until I finished. When he proposed, it wasn't with fireworks or flowers. It was on a pier at dusk, both of us still in uniform after a long week of cross-branch drills. The ocean was quiet. Our hands were calloused. He didn't kneel, just pulled out a simple ring and said, "Let me serve beside you, wherever that takes us." I didn't cry. I just said yes. Planning the wedding was an exercise in compromise. He didn't want spectacle. I didn't want pretense. We agreed on something small, grounded, and honest. The chapel at Norfolk. No bridesmaids. No orchestra. Just our people, my team. The ones who'd pulled me from wreckage and followed me into chaos without blinking. He asked if I'd wear a gown. I said I've worn one thing my whole life that tells the truth. Why change now? He didn't argue. then wear it proudly. A week before the ceremony, I mailed a card to my father. No expectations, just a gesture of finality. Inside it read, Saturday, 1300 hours, Norfolk Chapel. I'll be in uniform. There was no RSVP, no reply, nothing. Nathan asked me once if I still hoped he'd come. I said I didn't know. Hope and grief often wear the same uniform. The night before the wedding, we followed tradition and slept apart. He stayed with an old friend. I stayed on base in a guest quarters not far from where I'd once given my first operational briefing. At midnight, I ironed my uniform slowly, reverently. The brass reflected the faint overhead light like small suns. I paused over the fourth star fingers lingering. I had worn this in war zones and boardrooms during funerals and commendations. Tomorrow I would wear it for love. That felt right. That felt like peace. The morning of my wedding dawned with that particular kind of stillness that only comes on military bases before reveille. The sky was a perfect steel blue, as if the air itself stood at attention. I rose early, dressed in silence, and double-checked every detail with the precision that had defined my entire career. My hair pinned cleanly beneath my cap gloves, crisp boots shined to a mirror sheen. At 1200 hour, I arrived at the chapel. The parking lot was already filling, not with family, but with warriors. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in years. Men I'd served beside in South Korea, Bahrain, even during that dark winter in Ukraine. No one had formally invited them. They simply came, said they wouldn't miss it, said I didn't get to walk alone. Inside, the chapel pews were filling fast. Dress whites, navy blues, metals gleaming. The room looked like a sea of reverence. No frills, no excess, just presence. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I stood behind the chapel doors flanked by Marcus Hill and Torres, both now retired. Both fathers, both weathered by time and loss. Marcus leaned in and said, "You carried us through fire. We'll walk you to something better." I didn't speak, just nodded once, and then my phone buzzed. A message from a number I had never deleted, but hadn't dialed in over a decade. The screen lit up with 7 words, combat boots and medals. "You disgrace us." I stared at the message, not with shock, not even sadness, just an understanding so cold it felt like steel across the spine. Of course that's what he'd send. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the years I'd carved a path through doubt and duty. Just a final attempt to reduce me. I slipped the phone into my pocket without a word. No one asked what it said. They didn't have to. I smoothed the cuffs of my sleeves, took a breath deep into my ribs, and nodded to the usher. The chapel doors opened. And then it happened. The moment I will carry with me longer than any citation or command. From within the chapel, a single voice rang clear, "Admiral on deck," and every man and woman in that room, nearly 200 Navy SEALs, rose in perfect unison. No one had rehearsed. No one had been told. They just knew. My boots struck the floor in time, deliberate calm. The sound echoed against the high ceilings and stained glass. As I walked the aisle flanked by the 2 men who had once dragged me from gunfire and loss, I looked neither left nor right. Because I didn't need validation. I had become the proof. James stood at the front, hands folded neatly behind his back, eyes locked on mine. Not crying, but holding everything in a gaze. The chaplain, an old friend from overseas deployment, waited with quiet dignity. My team stood behind him, medals glinting like shared memory. When I reached the altar, Marcus and Torres stepped back with silent precision. James took my gloved hands in his and whispered, "You don't need vows for me to know. I've been married to your courage since day one. We kept our promises simple. We vowed to serve each other, to protect not just joy, but peace, to lead not just in public, but in the quiet places where leadership is hardest. I didn't say for richer or poorer. I said when the call comes, we go together. And when it was done, the chapel was silent, still. And then the applause. It was thunderous, but not loud. It was honest. It filled the space like breath, like recognition. We walked out under an arch of sabers not held by officers but by enlisted men. That mattered, because they were the ones who had followed me into the fire, who had seen me not as a symbol, but as a leader. Later at the reception, a former SEAL, 6'4", covered in ink, barely spoke a word, approached me. He looked down at my boots, then said, "We never stood because of the stars, ma'am. We stood because you never made us feel small." Then he hugged me, not like a subordinate, like a brother. I let him, not because I needed comfort, because I had earned it. And somewhere far away from that moment of glory, a man who had sent a message of shame had missed something sacred. But I no longer needed him to understand, because everyone else already did. It wasn't until 3 days into our honeymoon that the second message arrived, not from my father, but from an old teammate who couldn't make the ceremony. We were in Maine, tucked into a quiet coastal inn Nathan had found, the kind with creaky floors and the scent of salt baked into the wood. No phones, no press, just foggy mornings, blueberry pancakes, and silence that didn't demand anything. Nathan handed me my phone with a quiet, "You should see this." The message was from Sergeant Mason, one of my earliest deployments. It was a photo grainy taken from across the street. The chapel was in the background, but in the corner, unmistakable in posture and profile, stood a man, Colonel Patrick Wren, full dress uniform, arms crossed, back rigid, watching, not entering, no interaction, just stillness. The next photo came seconds later. He was turned slightly, walking away. I stared at the images longer than I meant to. Not out of heartbreak, out of curiosity. I didn't know what I was looking for. Regret, pride, closure. All I saw was distance. Nathan stood behind me quiet. Then he said he came, but he still couldn't stand. I nodded and folded the phone away. That moment echoed louder than the text, because it confirmed something I had already begun to accept. My father hadn't just chosen not to support me. He had chosen absence over evolution, to come so close and still walk away. It wasn't about disagreement. It was about control. And he had finally lost it. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I simply understood. I had carried the hope of his approval for too long, like a flag folded too tightly over a casket of dreams that had long since died. That day I walked along the shoreline barefoot, the cold sand grounding every step. Nathan joined me, our hands brushing in silence. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "What would you have done if he walked in?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have just nodded. But that opportunity passed. And maybe it was better that way, because sometimes clarity doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from watching someone choose the easy road again, and realizing you no longer need them on yours. I left the photo on my phone, not as a wound, but as proof that I had offered the door, and he had stayed outside. The invitation came 2 weeks later. It was official, stamped with the Department of Defense insignia, signed by Rear Admiral Langston himself. A closed-door summit on the future of inter-branch command ethics in leadership and transformation across combat disciplines. I was invited as a keynote speaker, not because I was the youngest female full admiral in recent history, not because of medals or firsts, but because the systems I had helped create had quietly saved lives. I almost declined. The idea of standing before politicians, power brokers, and old brass who once questioned my every promotion felt exhausting. But then I remembered the suicide note, the one left by a young instructor on base 6 months before. Quiet man, bright future, no red flags, just a folded piece of paper that ended with "Tell Admiral Wren thank you. She's the only one who ever saw me." That memory hardened my resolve. I said yes. The night of the speech, I wore full dress whites, no adjustments, no softening. The stars sat neatly on my shoulders. The ribbons told their stories. The room was filled with weight: senators, generals, advisors, men with voices that shaped policies they never had to execute. I told stories, not mine, theirs. The men and women who followed orders into fire because they trusted the voice that gave them. I spoke of reform not as disruption but responsibility, of tradition not as scripture but structure meant to serve, not stifle. And then I closed with this: respect isn't inherited. It isn't given by blood. It's earned by showing up, by standing up, and by doing right, even when no one is watching. There was silence, then applause, the kind that doesn't come from agreement, but from understanding. The next morning, a letter arrived at my office. Handwritten, cream envelope, no return address. But I recognized the script instantly. My father. I hesitated, then opened it. I didn't enter the chapel because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to. I didn't salute not because you didn't earn it, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I couldn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll allow it, I'd like to talk. No uniform, no rank. Just a father who's trying to understand the daughter he never took time to know. Frank. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I just sat with it. Nathan came home late that evening, found me at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. He said nothing at first, just waited. Then asked, "Do you want to see him?" I said I don't owe him anything. Nathan nodded. "Maybe not, but maybe you owe yourself the choice." That sentence stayed with me all night. The next morning I sent a message. Simple. Direct. Arlington. Thursday. 900. Mom's headstone. I didn't write anything else. I didn't know if he would come, but he did. On time. Dressed in civilian clothes. Slacks jacket. No medals. No defense. Just a man who looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Quieter. I stood at the grave already waiting, uniform pressed, cap beneath my arm. He approached slowly, didn't reach out, didn't try to apologize, just looked at me and said, "You look like your mother when you stand like that." We didn't talk about war, or medals, or ranks. We talked about her, about grief, about how silence sometimes feels like strength, but really is just fear. Before we parted, he stepped back, straightened, and then slowly, deliberately, he saluted. It wasn't textbook, not crisp, not perfect, but it was honest. I returned it, not because he had earned forgiveness, but because he had finally chosen truth. And sometimes that's the first step. I didn't tell anyone about the salute. Not at first. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't even closure. It was simply a moment of recognition, late imperfect, but real. I carried it quietly as I resumed my work. 6 months after the wedding, the Pentagon called again, this time with a different offer: oversight of a new Joint Operations Initiative, a task force aimed at rebuilding cross-branch training protocols, focusing on ethical command, trauma-informed leadership, and accountability. It was ambitious, risky. It was everything I had wanted 20 years ago when no one would listen. I said yes. The role meant visiting bases I hadn't seen in years, places that once felt like battlegrounds, literal and emotional. Instructors I had once clashed with now called me Admiral with sincerity. Younger officers took notes during my briefings. Some still whispered behind closed doors, but fewer and fewer. One day, I was scheduled to review a new recruit assessment program at Quantico. As I walked through the barracks, scanning faces, checking posture, I saw a name on the roster that stopped me cold. Corporal Cadence Hill. I asked to meet her. She was tall, sharp-eyed, stood like she belonged in chaos. She introduced herself with a calm nod and said, "My dad's Private Larkin. He said you dragged him out from hell." I smiled. "He's not wrong," she grinned back. "He said you didn't just save his life. You gave him someone to believe in, so I came to follow that standard." I didn't respond right away, just placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Then raise the bar." Moments like that weren't loud. They didn't trend, but they carved deep. That's when I understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't the medals or the titles, it was the ripple effect, the quiet echoes that returned years later in the footsteps of people who never forgot. Back at headquarters, the Defense Education Initiative reached out. They'd been studying my methods, resilience programs, leadership models, integrated mental health protocols. They wanted to expand them across ROTC campuses nationwide. Not glamorous, not command, but foundation. I accepted. The first seminar was scheduled at a university in North Carolina. I was asked to name the pilot program. I said, call it the Salute Standard. Not for what's worn, but for what's earned. When the invitation went public, a letter arrived at my home. Heavy cardstock, my name in block script. From my father. Inside, I watched your speech, read your proposals. You built something that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. And I finally see that now. I missed the standing ovation. But I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. Dad. Enclosed was a photo, taken from the back of the chapel behind the last pew. In the image, I stood near the altar, 200 seals at attention, and in the very back, a lone man, arms at his sides, watching, not saluting, not yet. Weeks later, I invited him to the ROTC keynote. He came, sat in the last row, said nothing, didn't interfere. Afterward, as I stood outside shaking hands with cadets and instructors, he approached, removed his cap, extended his hand. I took it. No cameras, no speeches, just a moment. "I'm proud of you," he said, then quieter. "And I'm sorry it took me so long." I nodded, not because it fixed everything, but because it started something. Nathan asked me that night, "Are you happy with how it turned out?" I thought for a long time, then said I'm satisfied, not because they suffered, but because real change happened. The silence broke, and the girl who used to iron her father's uniform now teaches cadets how to lead without fear. He smiled and kissed the top of my head. "Would you ever forgive him?" he asked. I answered, "Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a path." And today we took a step. 1 year to the day after my wedding, I stood on stage beneath bright white lights in Washington, D.C., receiving the Department of Defense's Excellence in Ethical Command Award. James was in the front row. So was my father. As the presenter listed my accolades, I didn't feel pride in the traditional sense. I felt still, anchored, not because I had finally been recognized, but because I no longer needed to be. When my name was called, I stepped forward in full uniform. The moment I took the podium, I heard chairs shift. A group of cadets all in white stood. And from the far right corner, so did Frank Wren. He raised his hand in salute, this time fully. Clean, steady, no hesitation, no shame. Afterward, we didn't say much. We stood under the fading afternoon sky watching attendees scatter into cars and hotels. My father looked older now, more real. Not the mythical colonel, just a man. He didn't try to make up for the years. But in his silence, I heard effort. That was enough. Later that summer, I returned to one of the first bases I had trained on. The walls still smelled of dust and iron. The halls remembered my boots. Inside a training room, I saw a familiar photo pinned to a bulletin board, a newspaper clipping of my wedding day. The saber arch, my shoulders squared beneath the stars. Below it, someone had scrawled in marker "lead" like her. I didn't know who had put it there. I didn't need to. What mattered was that someone had, that the example had taken root, and that root was growing. I spent the next months traveling seminars, workshops, base visits. No press, no politics, just quiet reform. Instructors began changing language, updating procedures. Suicide watch protocols tightened. Resilience check-ins became normal. I didn't design revolution. I created endurance. And that to me felt like leadership. It wasn't about breaking the system. It was about remaking it one honest conversation at a time. At one ROTC campus, I met a cadet named Avery. Brown eyes, clipped voice, held herself like she already belonged in the field. She shook my hand and said, "My dad was saved in Somalia by a woman who bled ice and dragged him through fire. He named me after her." I looked at her, saw the future, saw my past, and for the first time in years I felt the weight of legacy, not as burden, as proof that every step had mattered, every silence, every salute, every earned breath. And every time someone said I didn't belong, I had laid a stone for someone else to walk on. That was enough. That was everything. The final letter came in late spring, heavy envelope, no insignia, just my name written in careful block letters. Inside, my father had written, I watched your speech. I've read your proposals. You built a career that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. And I finally see that now. I miss the standing ovation, but I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. Dad, tucked within the fold was a photograph I didn't know existed. It was from my wedding day, taken from the very back of the chapel over the heads of seated seals. The sabers gleamed in the sunlight. The white of my uniform glowed beneath the stained glass. Every man stood in salute, and in the far rear corner, just barely in frame, stood my father, arms at his sides, watching, not saluting, not yet. I kept the photo in my drawer for weeks, pulling it out late at night when the world was quiet. Not because it hurt, but because it reminded me of how far silence could stretch before someone chose to end it. A few weeks later, I invited him to attend my keynote at the Defense Education Initiative. He came, sat in the back, didn't speak during the panel, didn't approach until after the crowd had thinned. I was outside shaking hands with cadets when he stepped forward, cap in hand. No cameras, no audience, just us. He extended his hand. I took it. He said, "I'm proud of you." Then after a pause, "And I'm sorry it took me so long." I didn't speak, just nodded. Not because I had no words, but because the moment didn't need more than truth. That night, James asked me, "Are you happy with how it turned out?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about it. About the years of silence, the nights filled with doubt, the rooms I'd entered alone. I thought about the salute, about standing tall without looking back, about every soldier who stood not because of rank, but because of respect. And I said, "I'm satisfied. Not because anyone suffered, but because real change happened. The system got stronger, the silence broke. And the girl who used to iron her father's uniform now has cadets pressing theirs because of what she built." He smiled and kissed my forehead. "Would you ever forgive him?" I stared at the ceiling for a long time before saying, "Forgiveness isn't a gift, it's a direction, and I'm walking toward it." A year passed, promotions came, initiatives expanded, bases grew quieter, safer, more human. And then one afternoon, I received a message from a former SEAL. It was short, simple. "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am. Never seen that many warriors cry during a ceremony." That was the day we realized something. Blood didn't salute, but we did. I showed the message to James. He read it, then looked at me and asked, "You going to respond?" I picked up my phone and typed, "Some gifts can't be returned, but some salutes, they stay with you forever." And I've learned that the strongest form of revenge isn't destruction. It's creation, not shouting back, but building something so strong they have to raise their eyes to see it. You don't always have to swing. Sometimes you just have to stand and let the world salute the truth you became.